Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome again to the Indian Ocean World podcast. Thank you so much for downloading. My name is Renee Manderville, a project manager at the Indian Ocean World Center, or IOWC, at McGill University. I am joined by two of our regular contributors, Drs. Archisman Chaudhuri and Philip Gooding, both of whom are postdoctoral fellows at the IOWC.
Hi, Renee. Thank you for having me here again today.
Hi, Renee. I'm glad to be here again.
Glad to have you guys. You'll hear more from them later on in the podcast. Today's guest is Professor Jon Unruh, an associate professor of geography at McGill University. Having earned a PhD in geography at the University of Arizona, he is now a partner of the IOWC's Appraising Risk project and the director of the Canadian Field Studies in Africa program, which is centered at McGill. His core research interests are war-affected land rights regimes, the peace process and recovery from armed conflict, and the intersection between land rights and environmental change. He has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, as well as 2 co-edited volumes, and has translated his work into a policy environment as a partner with the United Nations Environmental Program, or UNEP. His regional expertise in the Indian Ocean world ranges across the northeast of Africa, the Middle East, South Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. We are very honored that he has joined us to discuss his work today. Professor Unruh, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
We're delighted to have you. So Professor Unruh, in advance of this recording, you sent us 4 publications, all of which cover different regions in the contemporary Indian Ocean world. And for our listeners, by the way, the links to these articles are in the description of this podcast, and much of the discussion later in this podcast recording will focus on these publications. So check them out. One of these publications deals with Darfur, another with Yemen, another with Syria, and the last with Afghanistan. I also know that your wider work that you have experience working within the Indian Ocean world regions includes Ethiopia, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, and East Timor, not to mention several regions outside of the Indian Ocean world, such as Peru and Colombia. So I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of your research in this context. What do you do in relation to these diverse regions? How do you gain enough expertise to contribute to understandings of these regions and policies therein?
Thank you very much. Well, in terms of sort of an aggregate look at all of the regions, my primary methodology is field work. And so I don't quite spend, like an anthropologist would do, years and years in a village, but I do focus on specific problems and go to the field and spend usually a couple of months or so working on that problem. One thing I do focus on, of course, is war-affected recovery, primarily in terms of land rights, because land rights and armed conflict both are a spatial encounter. They affect each other incredibly. Wars are often about land, and in reverse, armed conflict, of course, completely reworks the relationships between people about land. Usually I use as the motor for this work on war-affected land rights connections to a United Nations line agency that is interested in recovery of land and property rights in a war-affected country. And so I joined the UN as part of a group to research and then make recommendations in terms of policy and practice as to how to put back together again a land and property rights system after armed conflict. So in that regard, that's a little different than, say, an academically funded piece of research. This is very specific. It does, of course, come with its own funding. It's not in terms of money, but it's in terms of in-kind rather, logistics and access to the different belligerent groups and combatant actors in a landscape after a conflict in order to access the different groups and see what their positions are with regard to land rights and how to put that back together again after war. I then take that research that I do. My first step is then to put it into a policy, practice, and a project format for the United Nations. Sometimes I help them implement that, but usually always I then take that material and turn it into an academic publication or two or three, depending on how relevant that can be. And so that's, so of course, then merges with an effort like the grants that the IOWC gets into a good bit of synergy back and forth in terms of basically focusing my research on problems and engaging in field work. As you can imagine, often after a conflict, there are best practices that have emerged. And so the United Nations and other international donors like this idea of best practice. In other words, what is the practice that has emerged elsewhere that looks good, or that has been tried in a number of places and it always rises to the top in terms of a workable solution? So when you go into a new place, for example, that I've never been to before, basically what they want me to do is to talk about these best practices that work well in other places. And so, for example, in East Timor and Sri Lanka, the first time I went there, it was to talk about Ethiopia and Mozambique and Yemen, et cetera, other places where certain constructs of post-war land and property rights recovery have worked, and then to try to tailor them into the Sri Lankan or East Timorese reality. And then I work hand in hand with local officials and the different sides in the conflict to try to implement a United Nations kind of sponsored idea. I'll just wrap up then and say that the package then that the UN likes to implement in a war-affected country is one of mass claim. So in a conflict, of course, there are hundreds of thousands, at times millions of people that are dislocated. They become refugees or internally dislocated persons, IDPs, and then after war, they all come flooding back. That flood then overwhelms any local domestic court system, set of laws, government ability to reintegrate all those people, complicated by the reality that the government was usually one of the belligerents in the conflict, and so trust is low in returning people to their land and property, to have government actually conduct an exercise to try to get people back on their lands. There's all sorts of suspicions as to the prospect of ethnic cleansing and demographic change, et cetera. So you need a trusted third party. That's usually the United Nations. It comes in and conducts a very large scale, what's called a mass claims housing, land, and property restitution program. These are quite large, quite cumbersome. They take a lot of time and engage in a lot of money, require a lot of money, but they try to, in a very large volume sort of way, conduct themselves with hundreds of thousands, often millions of individual claims, and move through that quickly to get people back onto their land and property. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of it. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded.
No, I think that was great length and very interesting to hear about, for sure. So thank you for saying that, Professor Unruh. I will now turn over questioning to Archisman and Philip.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, Professor Unruh. This is Archisman. I want to start by discussing your article, Weaponization of the Land and Property Rights System in the Syrian Civil War, Facilitating Restitution. As you argue, the Syrian Housing, Land and Property Rights System, or the HLP, has been turned into an effective weapon by the government to identify and displace dissenters of the regime. In this regard, you point out that administrative offices which house HLP records are destroyed, and that worsens the problem. However, you do point out that the process of destruction itself, use of social media by refugees and displaced people, and even the settling of new population on acquired land also produce a trail of evidence that can be read backwards to settle HLP claims. You also point out that the Syrian civil code and customary tenures in alliance with the aforementioned evidence can play a substantial role in settling HLP claims if and when displaced people return to Syria. My question is, could you elaborate on how such a methodology would, in a hypothetical or actual case of litigation, work through a web of claims and counterclaims and try to arrive at a solution?
Sure. So why don't we stick with the sort of actual cases and speak a little bit from history. So as I noted above, the UN has basically a package of activities that it takes into war-affected countries in order to very quickly produce solutions and a peace dividend so that people can become invested in a different way of conducting their lives. So in terms of housing, land, and property claims, and in the Syrian case, the millions of people, about 12.9 million people that will return from outside the country and from dislocation inside the country, that package is something that's called a transitional justice form of mass claims, housing, land, and property rights restitution. Transitional justice is a robust field of research and law. It is used in a policy and practice way by the UN and others to move forward very, very quickly in an approach that seeks to reattach people to their property in a variety of ways. So as you can imagine, it's pretty straightforward. If someone is dislocated from a house, they can return to that house. They have a title, no one else claims it, and that's very straightforward. It gets a little difficult if people never had documents in the first place, if it was lineage or tribal or religious held land, indigenous held land, etc., or if they lost those documents, or if documents were purposefully altered during the conflict, which is very common. Then what you need is a different strategy, and this is the transitional justice strategy. So basically, this is a combination of local domestic law and international law that seeks to bring together a tailor-made set of laws for the situation at hand. So, for example, you really can't have a set of laws that focuses on all the people returning needing to have a document before they get their land back when almost no people have documents. When they come back and nobody has a document, you have to come up with a new set of laws and practices that attends to that reality. If you don't, of course, then people won't engage the restitution program, and they will seek alternatives, and often those alternatives are very destabilizing. And Iraq and Afghanistan are very good examples of that. So this transitional justice approach, it's very fluid. It's been accused of being a little ad hoc. It's somewhere between use what's worked well elsewhere, pick and choose in a cherry picking kind of way what works in domestic law, and make it up as you go. And so it's a little rough around the edges. It is intended for dealing with the social injustice of enormous dislocations of people in a very, very quick way. So what happens when enormous numbers of people come back, you don't actually get to sort of look at or engage with or analyze each and every claim. That would take decades. What you do is you categorize claims, like claims into categories of people or types, and then that category receives a legal decision. It's compensation, it's your land back, it's a variety of other what are called remedies. In the Syrian war, what's happened is that there have been this purposeful dislocation, a purposeful attempt at demographic change, particularly in recovery. But what's interesting is that all of these set methods for dealing with very large numbers of claims are easily translatable into the Syrian reality, which is something new that we're seeing, because the Syrian dislocatees are very, very technology literate. They are able to check on their housing, land, and property from in exile. They have all sorts of things on their phones. They are very aware of the material on their phones and their social media activities and how that's relevant to creating evidence for a claim. So all of the informal ways of interaction with one's property, the fact that you have what legally is called intimate knowledge about your land and property. You know that land and property so much more intimately than someone else trying to come and fraudulently claim it, that you would be able to present that intimate knowledge and win your claim. Well, that intimate knowledge is a legal concept. It's brought into transitional justice and used. Customary, indigenous knowledge as well about land and property and in history is also brought into transitional justice. Normal sort of Western notions of what's not allowed as evidence for a claim, such as hearsay, meaning you're going to introduce something that you heard someone else say, usually it's not allowed. This has changed though, because this is oral history. Oral history about one's land and property is often the only thing people have. And so usually the evidence rules are changed to tailor to what people do have to present as a way to claim lands. And so in the Syrian case, the act, if you will, of dislocating people and the act of trying to put other people on their lands, the act of displacement, the act of destruction, are all captured now by what's been called the most heavily socially mediated civil war in history. Everything from satellite imagery to drones, to selfies, to social media, to statements, etc., are all now much more accessible. And so now we have the opportunity of taking these acts of displacement, these acts of expropriation and confiscation, and turning those, the material that creates, and using those for housing, land, and property claims. That's had such potential that a couple of European funders have funded an activity that is now widely known, whereby when a city fell to the opposition during the war, groups would go in and gather up all sorts of papers that were in the different ministries, the different field offices, etc., and took them out of the country to have them be translated. And these reveal the inner workings of dislocation and legal confiscation, etc. And the idea here is that these are now going to be used for future human rights litigation and issues against the Syrian state in the future. So it's a bit messy. These are all sort of different pieces of evidence that are assembled and that corroborate each other and that are used for claims as a methodology. Could go on, but I'll wrap it up there.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Unruh. If I just were to build on that, 2 points intrigued me as I read your article: a volatile interaction between peace-building priorities, road infrastructure reconstruction, and land rights in Afghanistan. I think these are common to Syria as well. For example, firstly, the local population, especially returning refugees, distrust legal processes, particularly due to corrupt bureaucracy. And eventually, you argue this leads them to back non-state actors like the Taliban and other warlords. Even in Syria, you do point out that often returning refugees distrust the government's legal structure when it comes to settling HLP claims. And just another point, in Afghanistan, you point out that provision of social justice, especially swift justice by insurgent groups like the Taliban, often helps them win trust among locals. In Syria, a different yet similar mechanism is at work, For example, you point out that opposition groups and the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant allow soldiers to settle in accommodations that have been vacated by displaced people. In both cases, I find that the objective is to create a viable alternative model of state or governance for the population. So, how do you think public policy makers can address this crucial issue of establishing trust in war-torn and war-affected countries?
Thank you. That's a critical a question, complicated as you just described. As you noted, the often insurgent groups go out of their way to provide what's called a social service providing effort to local populations. Western militaries like to call that winning hearts and minds. And so you can have a situation in Syria or Afghanistan where they try to get the local population on their side. Fairly easily done when the state is corrupt, is not able to provide services, and is seen as mistreating the local population. So you had situations where ISIL went out of their way in a land and property sense to take back land that have been confiscated by members of the elite in Syria and in Iraq, and return those to their rightful owners, very violently, of course. This wins the hearts and minds, if you will, of not just the people that got their land back, but everybody around them, of course. And the insurgent groups know this. Today, in fact, you have a number of insurgent groups going out of their way to provide for relief and including health services in COVID-affected areas of countries that are affected by conflict. Colombia is one of these. There's a number of these in Africa. As you can imagine, the local government is embarrassed by its inability to provide this health support, and this, of course, is being taken advantage of by insurgent groups. So there is this tug of war for trust among local populations between the insurgent groups and between the state. And so frequently you can have, for example, schools and health clinics and courts try to be promoted by the state, and then these things being attacked by the insurgent groups who do not want people to access those and instead want the people to access the insurgent groups' social service providing efforts of courts and education and health clinics as well. So trust is a pretty critical issue. Fast forward to the end of the war, it becomes paramount because the government usually always backed one side in the war, regardless of who wins. And so how to create trust in government, trying to do good things in terms of recovery among a local population when sympathies can be against the government. Often that requires a third party in terms of establishing that trust. This is an outside objective party. Usually it can be someone in the United Nations. It can be a United Nations institution. It can be an elder statesman from a different country. And Africa is good at producing a Kofi Annan or a Nelson Mandela that is seen broadly as being this elder statesman, this peacemaking actor that can be brought to bear on a situation and establish and lead institutions for trust building. And of course, as you can imagine, that can give sort of a head start on the building of trust. That doesn't necessarily quickly establish trust in government. That takes time. Often what can happen is that you have a belligerent group become a political party. So this is a common sort of scenario for the UN. So let's say take Mozambique, where you had Frelimo, the government, Renamo, the insurgency, coming together at the end of the war, and the international community changing Renamo from an insurgent group into a political party, and the warlords becoming members of parliament, etc. And you try to sort of manage that idea. Colombia, of course, is another case where the FARC guerrilla group for 50 years engaged in armed combat against the government is now a political party. This can be good and bad. It's definitely a way forward. It's politics is war by other means, but you also have a lot of difficulty where people who suffered under the FARC armed conflict having a great deal of difficulty thinking about them as a political party when they would like to have everybody be thrown in jail that belonged to the FARC. So at the early years, this is a rocky road in terms of establishing trust. It takes a great deal of attention. It takes the UN being in place doing what's called peace building over many years, sometimes a couple of decades. From outside, you can say, well, this peace building UN effort has been in this country or that country for a long period of time. We're wasting our money. They should be gone. And so that reveals a lack of comprehension about what it takes to really build trust and to have a third party that's trusted be present, shepherding this sort of reconstruction of government and belligerence into political parties in order to move forward. So that's a large scale, long-term, very clumsy, very rough justice approach to establishing trust, but you are talking about a fairly big picture solution involving millions of people that you want to go from one day to the next, solving their problems in a way that is other than armed combat. So that's one approach to establishing trust in war-torn countries.
Thank you so much for those answers, Professor Unruh, and I would leave the questioning now to Philip.
Thanks, Archisman, and thank you, John, for detailing your research and for answering those questions. I've got a couple of questions. One based on your article referring to Yemen post-Arab Spring, and one referring to your article on Darfur. Although they're focused, or the questions are inspired by those articles, I'm going to try and keep the questions quite broad. Start with the questioning from your article from Yemen. In this article, you made recommendations for how the government's land restitution program should reform itself once it recommenced. At the time of writing in 2016, it was suspended. I can only assume, given the ongoing conflict, that it remains suspended. Thus, I wonder, have the last 4 years changed any of your conclusions or recommendations? Or more broadly, in what ways is your scholarship adaptable to what are often clearly very fluid situations? Like, will you be updating this article in any way moving forward? Or do you feel the need, or do you think you will need to? Alternatively, and if the program is not suspended, how has the Land Commission worked under the current circumstances?
Yes, thank you. It is suspended in Yemen, and the current approach there, unfortunately, has actually fallen quite apart. That approach defaulted to the conventional way of engaging land and property restitution, which is that if you have a claim, you travel to the capital, which is Aden, in the south of the country. You stand in long lines, often for days. And when you get to the front of the line, you're given a form that you then fill out. You submit that form that you filled out by hand together with your documented evidence. That then goes to a large pile that has to be then entered into a database. That's the process that was underway when the Houthi incursion started in the south. And so all of that physically based material, the forms, people's actual evidence, and in this case, this included very old land titles, sometimes written on parchment, sometimes written on sheepskin, originals that go back to the era of sultans, etc., were all destroyed. And so in that regard, that sort of heightens the recommendation of needing to go more online. Just the simple act of coming and standing in line excludes women. right? So in Yemen, women, head of households, were unable to go and stand in line and make a claim. It excluded sort of minorities. Everybody can see who's in line. And so it was really fraught with a lot of difficulty, even before it kind of fell apart, and all the different forms and whatnot were sort of blown to the wind in the conflict that actually entered into Aden. Parts of the forms and the claims had been entered into the database, and one hopes that database in different pieces is still stored somewhere. Which gets us to your question of fluidity. Situations that are very, very fluid. One could argue have a separate set of tools. So it is one situation to be after a war, where the United Nations blue helmets are in place. They have prevailed militarily, and there is more or less calm. That's one situation to work in. In that case, the United Nations is keeping the peace. They're engaging in disarmament. And so you can move forward with ideas of claim. In Yemen or in Darfur, where you're not there yet, is very, very fluid. But what's interesting is that there's still tools. And Darfur is a good example of that. Darfur, like all conflicts, if you look at the different belligerent groups, they all have their what are called narratives of grievance. It is a narrative. It is a story that a belligerent group tells itself about why they're fighting, whose fault it is, how they have been wronged in history, and why they deserve to gain what they gain and pursue what they pursue in armed conflict. So if you take the case of Darfur, and you look at the group that's called the Janjaweed and their constituency. So the Janjaweeds are the pointy end of a large constituency that it is comprised of nomadic pastoralists. And so that narrative of grievance for that entire group has it that they were cheated out of land over a great deal of time, starting from the Sultanate period, going to the colonial period, and now in the independence period. And so this sort of cheating of their land allows them to say that they now deserve what they can take. The previous government under Bashir in Sudan used that narrative of grievance to basically say, you can go and keep lands that you conquer, that you take away, that you empty of the farmers that, of course, supported the initial insurgency in Darfur. That then led to what we know to be the Darfur conflict. So that narrative of grievance is a tool that is used by the different belligerent sides in a conflict. And what's interesting is that such a narrative can be tinkered with from the outside. It can also be used as a tool by something like the United Nations. So I was in Darfur when the International Criminal Court made it known that President Bashir was indicted. That created its own narrative. And so that pretty quickly led to a sea change among the belligerent groups, primarily the Janjaweed and the other militias around it, that made them think twice about what they were doing. Because if their primary backer, Bashir at that time, was to be indicted, would they be next? Or would they also be in trouble? Would they in some way not have the advantageous positions that they had? So you saw very quickly their narrative change about how they were conducting the conflict. It became clear to them that they would not be able to take and keep the land that they confiscated from farmers. It made them start to second guess, and it actually opened up opportunities for restitution and for peace building. So I would argue that idea of playing around with narratives and playing around with narratives of grievance and the narratives that the different belligerent groups use as a way to justify their actions in armed conflict can be altered, can be played with from the outside by the international community, and that further research needs to be done about how to do that and the effects on the ground. So that gets at a different tool for very fluid situations. If we look back to the Bosnian conflict in the Balkans, this was the first sort of really vivid case of large-scale ethnic cleansing. That idea of deserving the land that you take over, that you clean from the inhabitants, was very much a narrative. The international community sort of inadvertently introduced a counter narrative that resulted in those that took land coming to the conclusion they know that they're on someone else's land, and they know that that's unjust, and that they know that there's going to be a coming wave of activities that will seek to take that land away from them. So if you introduce even something as small as doubt into this notion, this process of ethnic cleansing, that those who clean will not be able to keep the land and property that they gain, that doubt allows for opportunities to be pursued. So you would like to enlarge in that doubt. You would like to work with that. So again, that's a narrative that you can pursue. So these things are very broad scale. They're very kind of rough around the edges, and they're very sort of clumsy, but they are for very fluid, large scale situations. So that there are examples out there where these tools can be used in fluid situations, and one would like to see greater research into how to refine such tools for those fluid situations.
Thank you, John, for that answer, and thank you for drawing your attention to the narratives of grievance. Indeed, I was going to ask you a question about that, about elaborating the potential strategies for ensuring land rights contribute to peace rather than war, and your discussing of doubt and the need for further research actually answers those questions already. Therefore, I think I'll pass over to Renee to wrap up from here.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Unruh, for all of that really interesting and eye-opening information on transitional justice and the way that it's applied in these different states and in these different nations throughout the Indian Ocean world. So thank you so much for joining us today, for detailing your research, and for answering all of our questions so effectively and in so much detail. Thank you to Archisman and Philip for asking those questions, and thank you to you, the listeners, for downloading. Once again, my name is Renee Manderville, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.